Roy Brady never imagined that a piece of land his grandfather fenced off with cedar posts and barbed wire in 1953 would one day sit at the edge of a place like this, a planned community with color-coded mailboxes, artificial ponds stocked with sterile carp, and a governing board that issued weekly newsletters about acceptable porch lighting and lawn gnome sizes. His property stood like a splinter in the foot of this polished neighborhood. 52 acres of functional, ugly, honest land, a working farm, not for show, but for output. The kind of place where work boots lived by the door and nothing smelled right unless it stank. But Roy liked it that way, and he had never once apologized for it. The truth was, Roy didn't hate the neighborhood. He just didn't see any use in pretending they were all the same kind of people. He knew what the subdivision was the moment they started building it, just on the other side of the county line that split his land from what used to be a neglected drainage basin and was now a boutique wetland restoration project. That was a fancy way of saying they dug some trenches, dropped in cattails, and pretended it was all natural. Roy watched the first McMansion rise like a tumor on the other side of the old fence line, and he figured it would be the first of many. He wasn't wrong. It didn't take long before the new residents started turning up their noses. They complained that his pigs were too loud, his tractors too early, the smell of manure too strong, and his barn too close to their view. He listened at first, out of politeness more than interest, but stopped bothering when the conversation turned from suggestion to insinuation. It wasn't subtle. They wanted him gone. But the land was his, fully deeded, grandfathered out of any zoning change, untouchable by the neighborhood board no matter how many times they tried to drag him into compliance meetings he wasn't legally required to attend. For years, Roy did what he always had: raised hogs, repaired machinery, fixed his own fences, and kept to himself. He was not a bitter man. He just didn't believe in unnecessary conversation, especially when the person doing the talking already had an answer they wanted to hear. So, when the community's social committee started approaching him about opening a corner of his field for seasonal events, harvest festivals, Easter egg hunts, even a sustainable living weekend, whatever the hell that meant, he told them no, flatly, and repeatedly. He didn't rent land to people who wanted to be one with the earth, only until it got muddy. It was an early Saturday in spring when Roy noticed something wasn't right. The fence line along the west pasture, the one closest to the subdivision, was cut clean through. Not broken, not trampled, but sliced, surgically and evenly, with enough care that someone had clearly taken their time. The gap was about 8 feet wide, and the ground nearby had fresh tire marks from a small truck or trailer. He stood there for a long while, one hand on his hip, the other tracing the fresh edge of the wire, still glinting like it had been snipped just minutes ago. He didn't say anything, didn't curse or yell, just walked back to the shed and got his camera, took photos from every angle. Then he sat on the porch and waited. The sun climbed, birds circled, and around 11, a white van rolled in through the subdivision's back access road and drove straight onto his pasture, through the gap. 3 men in polos and tool belts stepped out and began unloading metal poles, folding chairs, and canvas tents. Roy stayed still, sipping coffee. It took them 20 minutes before they noticed him. One of them, mid-30s, lots of gel in his hair, clipboard, walked up with a half-smile and a sort of preemptive apology in his eyes. "Sir, sorry if we startled you. We're here to set up for the Evans-Lewis wedding this afternoon. Shouldn't be too disruptive. We'll be off your land by nightfall." Roy stared at him. "You're on the wrong land." Clipboard guy faltered. This is parcel 481-C, correct?" "No," Roy said, not moving. "This is parcel 481-A. You're standing on my field. That fence wasn't down yesterday." The man looked pale. He fumbled with his phone, muttering about paperwork. Roy watched him flail for a few minutes, then stood up. "You didn't cut that fence yourself, did you?" No, sir. We were told the space was arranged in advance. Permitted and everything. You'll have to talk to, the event organizer. She's probably en route now." Roy nodded slowly and walked past him, across the field, and stood at the edge of the tent they were beginning to raise. His pasture, used for hog rotation, was dotted with dry manure, uneven dirt, and the lingering odor of livestock. Hardly the place for a ceremony. And yet, here were folding chairs in neat little rows, a sound system, a podium, and 2 floral columns with silk ribbons flapping in the breeze. He looked back at the man with the clipboard. "Pack it all up. Now." "Sir, I don't think you understand." "I understand perfectly," Roy interrupted. "What I don't understand is who the hell thought it was okay to trespass, destroy my fence, and turn my farm into a goddamn venue." They didn't pack up. Instead, they called someone. Roy heard them whispering, caught a few words. "Hostile. Threat of escalation. Owner says no. Get Karen here fast." That was the name he expected to hear. Karen Bledsoe, chairwoman of the neighborhood board, organizer of every community event since the place was built. She was the type who wore neutral colors, sent follow-up emails within 30 seconds, and ended every sentence like it was an official warning. Karen arrived in a BMW, of course. Beige. She stepped out in linen and pearls, holding a tablet and a smile that belonged more to a courtroom than a pasture. "Roy," she said, walking straight toward him. "So good to see you. I was hoping we could have a calm, neighborly discussion." "I'm not your neighbor," Roy replied. "You built up to my fence, not the other way around." She gave a light laugh like they were old friends sharing a joke. "Technically, this corner section is a shared easement. It's been designated for occasional community use. You should have received the letter 2 months ago." "I didn't, and it's not." "It's a bit late to argue," she continued, gesturing around. "The wedding starts at 4. There are over 100 guests coming. Vendors, caterers, musicians. I can assure you we'll leave everything cleaner than we found it. It's one afternoon, then we're gone." Roy looked at her, long and level. "You cut my fence." Karen's face didn't flinch. "The board authorized a temporary opening. The fence will be restored by Monday. We even budgeted for new posts." "You authorized an opening in something you don't own?" Karen tilted her head, still smiling. "Let's not get litigious, Roy. It's just land. And you're not exactly using it today, are you?" Roy didn't respond. He just walked back to his porch, stepped inside, and locked the door. He didn't call the sheriff again. That was pointless. He didn't argue. He didn't yell. He sat at his kitchen table and looked out the window as strangers trampled his pasture, dragging in buffet tables, generators, and strings of solar lights. He watched Karen direct people like a stage manager, smiling and waving as if she were already mother of the bride. He watched them ignore his property like it was their own. And he thought, not for the first time, how easily people convinced themselves they were entitled to things simply because they believed the alternative was inconvenient. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the final tent peg was driven into his dirt, Roy went to the barn, opened the latch on the south pen, and counted 302 hogs. Restless. Waiting. He smiled, not because he wanted revenge, but because he believed in natural consequences. And there was nothing more natural than what pigs did when you put them in the middle of chaos. Roy didn't sleep that night, not in the way people usually meant it. He lay in bed with his eyes closed, but sleep didn't come. It hovered somewhere outside the window, like the low hum of the string lights still glowing over his field. He could see the pale, artificial dots stretching across the pasture through the slits in the barn wall like a second set of stars. Bright, planned, silent. Inside his house, everything smelled like dirt and wood smoke and the faint musk of old livestock feed. Outside, everything was flowers and money. 2 worlds divided by a line of barbed wire that no longer existed. By morning, he was already dressed and in the shed by 5. boiling water on the propane burner and double-checking the integrity of the portable livestock gates he kept for fair season. Not because he planned to take his pigs to town, but because he wanted options. Because people like Karen only understood options once you demonstrated they weren't the only ones who had them. By 7:30, the first vehicle rolled up again, a white catering van, followed closely by a black SUV with tinted windows and ribbons tied to the side mirrors. Roy watched them from the porch, arms crossed, coffee in hand. The drivers glanced at him but didn't stop. They drove across his property like it was theirs, wheels pressing deep into the soft dirt he'd just turned the week before. They didn't ask. They didn't wave. It was the kind of behavior you'd expect from someone who'd mistaken permission for ownership. And Roy knew that mistake didn't come from ignorance. It came from comfort. They were comfortable believing the line didn't matter anymore, that he wouldn't do anything, that he couldn't. Around 9, he received a call from the sheriff's office. Not a dispatcher this time, but Deputy Claire Morrison, a younger woman with a steady voice and an old-school patience he appreciated. She asked if he was available to discuss the situation on his property. He said he was. She arrived 20 minutes later in her cruiser, parked it by the broken fence, and walked the last few feet with the kind of careful neutrality Roy had seen in courtroom guards and livestock judges. She didn't smile. She didn't ask how he was. She asked if he would walk her through the facts. Roy did. He pointed out the cut in the fence. Still there, no attempt at repair. He showed her the tire marks, the construction debris, the alignment of the event tent that now straddled a full acre of his rotational grazing pasture. Claire nodded, taking notes on a clipboard. When he was done, she asked if he had granted permission for anyone to use his land. He said no. She asked if he'd received written notice. He said no again. She sighed, stepped back, and looked across the pasture where a small group of women were pinning lace to the front of the archway. "They told us it was permitted," she said. "Said it was a joint-use plot. The board filed something with the county last month." Roy's brow furrowed. "There's no joint use here. I've got full title, no liens, no easements, no shared anything. This land's never been redrawn." Claire didn't argue. She nodded, flipped through her notepad, and said she'd follow up with the clerk's office. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "If it helps, I've seen your parcel map myself. Last time we handled that dispute with the ditch runoff." "Nothing's changed on file." Roy thanked her. She handed him a card and said to call if anything escalated. He appreciated the gesture, but he also saw the unspoken part. She wasn't going to stop the wedding. She didn't want to be the one to explain to 100 out-of-towners that their rented chairs were sitting on someone's lawsuit. It wasn't about right or wrong. It was about noise, optics, and pressure. Karen had positioned this like a public good, and Roy, whether he liked it or not, had been painted as the unreasonable recluse standing in the way of joy. By noon, the wedding machine was in full motion. Trucks unloaded platters of pre-made hors d'oeuvres. Men in sunglasses and headsets ran cables through his soil, and a string quartet tuned their instruments beneath a canopy decorated with baby's breath. He spotted a portable restroom trailer parked just shy of the chicken coops and a beer cooler nestled against one of his water tanks. A woman in a floral dress wandered too close to the sow enclosure and screamed when a pig grunted near the gate. Roy didn't move. He watched from the corner of the barn. Silent. Still. He had no intention of interfering. Not directly. Interference could be twisted, reframed, made into something else. But he would document. Every hour. Every change. Every footprint across his rows. He emailed his attorney just after lunch. A short, curt message. Trespass confirmed. No formal approval. Interference with operations. Livestock safety compromised. Photographic evidence attached. The reply came in less than 20 minutes. Escalate to cease and desist. Pursue injunction if no reversal by end of day. Roy read it twice, leaned back in his chair, and tapped the side of his thermos with one knuckle. The thing about laws was that they moved slow. Slower than pigs, slower than rumors, and far too slow to stop something that had already been paid for. Even if he won the suit, even if the court ruled in his favor 6 months from now, it wouldn't change the fact that his land had been violated, that his fence had been severed, that every inch of pasture now reeked of cheap perfume and champagne. Instead of hay and sweat and time, then came the real insult. At 3 o'clock, Roy discovered that someone had run an extension cord from his barn's exterior outlet, one he used for feed pump maintenance, directly to the speaker setup at the ceremony site. His electricity. His power. Not even asked. Just plugged in, like it belonged to them. The cable stretched 100 feet across the pasture, half hidden under a burlap runner. He followed it to the base of a sound system the size of a refrigerator and found a young man in a vest monitoring the levels. "Who authorized you to plug into my barn?" Roy asked. The man blinked, then glanced around like someone else might answer. We were told the property owner approved it." "I am the property owner." A beat. Then the man stepped back and stammered something about not wanting trouble. Roy pulled the cord from the socket and walked away with it, coil by coil as the ambient music sputtered and died. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten. He left the cable by the side of the barn, then went into the house and bolted the door. Enough was enough. It was then, just as he sat down to finally breathe, that he heard it. Someone at the side gate rattling the latch. He stepped out again and found Karen herself standing there, arms crossed, a small walkie-talkie in one hand and a look that said she'd prepared a speech. "Roy," she said, not bothering with small talk. "We need that power. The ceremony starts in 30 minutes. You're done stealing my fence. You're done stealing my field. You're not stealing my power." Karen exhaled slowly. "No one is stealing. You're making this difficult. The board approved the setup. We've invested thousands. Families have flown in from 4 states. And frankly, you're embarrassing yourself." Roy took a step forward, enough that Karen had to tip her head back slightly to meet his gaze. "You've got 10 minutes, he said, "to get every last guest off my land. After that, I won't be responsible for what happens next." Karen didn't flinch. That sounded like a threat. "It's not. It's livestock management." He left her standing there and returned inside, closing the door behind him. She didn't knock again. She didn't need to. She thought she'd won. They all did. That was the funny thing about people who felt entitled to control. They never considered that others might be equally entitled to reclaim it. Roy didn't plan revenge. He didn't hatch schemes. He just did what made sense to a man who'd spent his life understanding cycles, thresholds, cause and effect. At 3:47 p.m., with the ceremony music testing its limits on a backup generator and the first verse of an instrumental version of "Can't Help Falling in Love" drifting through his kitchen window, Roy stood, stretched his shoulders, and walked out to the south enclosure. He opened the gate, then stepped aside. 300 hogs didn't wait for instructions. They didn't understand property law or wedding etiquette or public image. They understood scent, noise, movement. They understood open space. And when they saw it, they ran. The sound that came next was not like anything Roy had ever heard, not even on the worst days of sorting or during the birth panic of a large sowing. It was chaos, but with rhythm. A pulsing, snarling stampede, underscored by squeals and the tearing of soft fabric, the crunch of plastic, the dull drumbeat of hooves colliding with tables. The hogs surged into the wedding site like a flood with muscle, their massive bodies moving as one, jostling and bucking and charging with a purpose they didn't even understand. Roy stood back from the gate, arms folded, silent. He had no interest in watching the destruction unfold for the sake of it. He'd already seen what people were willing to do when they believed something was owed to them. Now it was time for them to experience the cost of treating land like background noise. He walked back toward the barn, leaving the scene behind him. From inside the house, the sounds were muffled. Screams, the whine of feedback from the sound system. Shouts that might have been names or just panic. Roy poured himself a glass of water and sat down at the kitchen table, looking out the window where the edge of the pasture met the paved access road. A man in a suit was running across the grass, dodging hogs, waving his arms at nothing in particular. Nearby, one of the catering tables had been flipped entirely. Chafing dishes scattered like battlefield debris, steam still rising from mashed potatoes that now steamed atop trampled confetti. The tent sagged on one side, one of its support poles knocked loose. The archway where Karen's son and his bride had presumably planned to exchange vows was tilted at an angle, its fabric shredded, one of the silk ribbons lodged in a pig's tusk like a morbid party trick. The bride herself, he only recognized her from the floral train she'd worn earlier, was standing on a folding chair, screaming at a group of people who didn't seem to be listening. A child sobbed nearby, covered in frosting. By the time the first emergency responder showed up, a fire marshal judging by the insignia on his chest, the situation had devolved into farce. The Hogs weren't violent, they weren't even particularly aggressive. They were just there in force, wandering, sniffing, bumping into things and people with the casual confidence of creatures who had no idea they weren't invited. One had found the cake table and was lapping up icing with its snout. Another had discovered a discarded gift bag and was nosing through the tissue paper. The guests were scattering in all directions, but most were hesitant to touch the animals. Whether it was fear, shock, or some leftover sense of decorum, they stayed on the sidelines, yelling and pointing and doing very little that could be described as productive. Roy finished his water and stepped outside, walking slowly toward the cluster of vehicles now trying to leave through the narrow entry road, which was partially blocked by the porta-toilet trailer. Several guests were arguing with one another in loud, theatrical voices, most of them dressed in clothes now smeared with mud or worse. A woman holding a wireless microphone was shouting into it, though the speaker system had long since gone silent. Roy passed them without a word and made his way to the far edge of the pasture, where the deputy from earlier, Claire, was stepping out of her cruiser again, her expression caught between disbelief and calculation. He raised a hand in greeting. She didn't smile. "Roy," she said slowly, walking up to meet him near the fence line, "I think you need to tell me what happened here." "I let my pigs out," he replied. "They had the right of way. It's their pasture." Claire looked past him at the wreckage. This is not how things get resolved. You know that." Roy nodded. "I didn't touch a single person, didn't destroy any property. I didn't even cross the boundary. I simply opened a gate." "You opened it, knowing they would disrupt the event." Roy didn't flinch. "I opened it because this is their home, and people built a party on top of their food source, with no permission, no notice, and no recourse." Claire exhaled and looked back toward the road. "Do you have it documented?" "Everything," he said. "Every hour, every change, photos, timestamps, receipts, fence cut, power siphoned, pasture compromised. It's all ready." Claire didn't answer for a moment, then finally said, "Stay here. Do not escalate. I'll call it in." He nodded once. She walked back to her vehicle, speaking into the radio as she went. Moments later, 2 more units arrived, this time local police, and Karen finally emerged from the ruins, hair askew, shoes missing, and a fury on her face that could have burned down every tree on the ridge if it had heat behind it. She stormed toward Roy, dragging one heel through the grass, 2 officers trailing just behind her. "You absolute lunatic," she hissed. "You'll pay for this. Do you understand me? I will sue you into the ground. I will have you removed. This is a crime." Roy didn't speak. Karen turned to the officer nearest her. "I want him arrested. Now." The officer looked uncertain. "For what, exactly?" "Trespassing, destruction of property, terroristic intimidation, you name it." He was on his land, Claire said, stepping between them. He released a stampede of wild pigs into a gathering of people. They're not wild, Roy said quietly. They're domesticated. And unarmed. One of the officers stifled a chuckle. Karen's face turned red. You think this is funny? No, Roy said. I think this is overdue. It took 3 hours to sort the scene. Animal control showed up, but had nothing to do. The pigs weren't hurting anyone. Most had wandered back toward their pens on their own, or were herded with minimal effort. By dusk, Roy's field looked like a battlefield post-retreat. Broken chairs, torn decorations, upturned trash cans, but no injuries, no violence, no real damage. Just humiliation. The wedding was over. The guests were gone. The DJ had packed up his ruined equipment and left without a word. Karen lingered, fuming beside her car as Roy walked past her for the last time that evening. "You've made enemies today," she said through her teeth. Roy didn't stop walking. Then they shouldn't have started a war. He went home, showered off the dust and sweat, and sat in the dark, alone in his kitchen with a cold beer and a blank notepad. Not to write a plan, just to record what mattered, the lines that were crossed, the things they took for granted, the things he was still willing to protect, and the things he would never allow again. The days that followed unfolded not with fury, but with silence, the kind of silence that doesn't come from peace but from calculation. The neighbors didn't speak to Roy, not directly. No more passive-aggressive smiles at the gas station, no tight nods from behind steering wheels, no brittle greetings at the post office. Instead, they watched. They passed by slowly when they drove past the pasture, eyes lingering on the repaired fence posts and the muddy furrows where folding chairs had once stood. Roy, for his part, didn't watch them back. He had work to do. The field was a mess, and while he hadn't caused the destruction himself, it still fell on him to restore it. The pigs were fine. Better than fine, actually. Whatever they'd managed to scarf down during the ceremony had left them sluggish and content for 3 days. Roy reinforced their enclosures not because he feared another incursion, but because he now understood something fundamental. People like Karen didn't retreat. They recalibrated. On the 3rd morning, a man in a dress shirt and polished shoes arrived at Roy's gate with a clipboard and a polite cough. He introduced himself as an environmental compliance consultant, hired by the county to investigate a complaint about agricultural runoff and improper livestock waste containment. Roy didn't argue. He let the man onto the property, walked him through every system, manure berms, feed storage, stormwater channels, all of it in line with state code. The man nodded a lot, made notes, asked if Roy had recently hosted a large gathering or event that might have altered the land usage. Roy answered truthfully. Not by choice. The man hesitated, then moved on. When he left, Roy knew the visit had less to do with environmental concerns and more to do with pressure. Some invisible lever being pulled from behind the safety of Karen's living room. Her reputation bruised, but not broken. Her energy redirected, like water finding a new downhill path. By the end of the week, Roy received a letter. Not certified, just slipped into his mailbox like junk mail. It was printed on letterhead from the neighborhood committee, though it wasn't addressed to him by name. The wording was bureaucratic, rehearsed. We regret the unfortunate incident at the April event and recognize the disruption caused. However, in the interest of maintaining positive relations and continued progress toward community cohesion, we propose a negotiated land use arrangement whereby Parcel 481-A may be subject to limited access provisions, compensatory infrastructure, funding, and event scheduling oversight. It wasn't an apology. It was a rebranding. They were still coming for his land. Only now they were offering to call it a partnership instead of a takeover. Roy read the letter twice, folded it neatly, and burned it in the fireplace without ceremony. He didn't keep copies of insults. That night he sat at the edge of the barn with a can of oil and sharpened the blade on the post-hole auger. Not because he needed to dig more fence. His perimeter was now steel cable and concrete, overkill by any measure, but because the act itself was calming. The rhythm of maintenance. The feel of metal honed by purpose. He thought of his grandfather, the way he used to sit on this same bench, squinting into the wind with a jaw full of chewing tobacco and nothing kind to say about people who thought politeness was the same as permission. Roy didn't have many memories that weren't soaked in work, in weather, in the slow erosion of privacy by those who thought they were doing you a favor just by including you. But this attempted erasure of his ownership, was different. It wasn't ignorance. It was willful disregard dressed up as civic improvement. The next morning, his attorney called. The firm had received an official request for arbitration. Karen and her board were claiming that the fence cut had been an accidental overstep during temporary easement exploration, and that the wedding had been a coordinated community event, protected under some obscure clause of their neighborhood bylaws. Roy's lawyer laughed bitterly when reading the claim. They're throwing everything they have at the wall. They know it won't stick, but the more noise they make, the more pressure they think they'll create. They're hoping you'll settle for a payout and sign a limited access agreement. Roy listened in silence, then asked a single question. Is there any merit? None, the lawyer replied. Not even under their own charter. You're not under their jurisdiction. This is a bluff. Roy thanked him and hung up. The call didn't bring peace. It brought clarity. They weren't just embarrassed. They were threatened. And that meant they would keep escalating until they were either exhausted or legally cornered. So Roy decided to exhaust them. He pulled every document tied to his property, title, historical survey maps, soil records, utility accounts, and made a packet. He didn't send it to the board. He sent it to the county assessor's office, marked with a note, for reference in light of recent encroachment activity. He made copies for his insurance provider, the zoning department, and, most critically, the Agricultural Safety Commission. Not as complaints, as preemptive context. That evening, a delivery truck appeared without a driver. Just the truck, its engine idling, a sheet of plywood roped to the side with a banner reading, "Clean up your shit." Literally, spray-painted in orange. Roy reported it to the sheriff, who dispatched Claire again. She didn't find it funny this time. Her mouth was tight, her eyes narrowed. "They're testing boundaries," she said. "You handled the first incident legally, but if this turns into harassment, we can escalate from civil to criminal. Just keep documenting." "I am," Roy said. She nodded, then paused. "Do you want a patrol to cruise past here at night? Just in case." "No," Roy replied. "If they come in the dark, I want them to know I see them first." Claire didn't press. She just handed him a card with a direct number and left. Roy watched the taillights disappear and stood for a while at the edge of his property, the cold wind licking at his face. There were no guests now, no white tents or crystal glasses. Just the open land, the rebuilt fence, and the long, dark quiet of a place that belonged wholly to him. But that quiet would not last. There was something distinctly unnatural about watching a perfectly orchestrated system begin to come undone in slow motion. Not with a bang, but with rot. Not a single grand confrontation, but a series of precise, small violations that cut deeper than any fence ever could. Roy didn't need to be told what was happening. He saw the signs before they were even visible to the naked eye. The cars parked just a little too close to his pasture. The half-empty soda bottles tossed over the fence. The subtle increase in noise after dark. Voices drifting over from porches that used to be silent after 9. It wasn't a coincidence, and it wasn't random. It was pressure, applied methodically like a vice being tightened one turn at a time. Karen and her board might not have been able to touch Roy's land with a vote or a bylaw, but they had something else. An audience. And now they were shifting tactics. If they couldn't make him sell, they could make him uncomfortable. It started with utilities. Roy noticed a drop in water pressure one morning while rinsing the troughs. Nothing dramatic, just enough to make the process take twice as long. At first, he assumed it was maintenance, but a call to the county yielded no reports of line work in his area. He checked the main valve, followed the lines, dug down in the soil to expose the feeder connection. What he found wasn't damage. It was a new valve, unauthorized, installed at the junction where his line branched from the old municipal main. Someone had tampered with it, limiting flow. He documented the discovery, took photos, filed a report. The county said they'd investigate, but their tone suggested they had other priorities. Then came the power issues. On a windy night, the breaker in his barn tripped 3 times. Roy initially blamed his own wiring, but when he stepped outside to reset the main panel, he noticed the junction box hanging half open, the latch broken, wires inside slightly twisted. Not cut, not ripped, just handled. Just enough to rattle the connection, to create the illusion of instability. He repaired it himself, reinforced the casing with a steel cover plate, and installed a battery-powered trail camera pointed at the access point. 2 nights later, the footage showed a man, hood up, gloves on, walking calmly to the box and standing there, motionless as if waiting. He never touched anything. Just stood, looked around, and left. Roy didn't recognize him. That made it worse. But it was the animals that pushed him past the line. One morning, just before dawn, he opened the south pen to find 2 of his hogs slumped near the gate, breathing shallowly. Their feed had been tampered with. He knew it instantly. The pellets looked wrong. A quick test with water showed the presence of something oily, synthetic. He called the vet, isolated the animals, and submitted samples. The diagnosis was inconclusive, but pointed to chemical contamination, likely from an external source. The hogs survived, but Roy didn't sleep that night. He sat in the barn with the lights off, shotgun across his lap, not expecting anything specific, just unwilling to be caught off guard again. His attorney advised him to escalate, file a restraining order, push for an injunction, press charges for trespass and malicious interference. Roy agreed, on paper, but in practice he hesitated. Not because he feared the fight, but because he knew the game wasn't happening in court anymore. It was happening in whispers, in dark corners, in anonymous tips to the zoning board, and quiet conversations at town hall meetings where Roy's name was passed around like an inconvenience. The more noise he made, the more they painted him as unstable. The media hadn't picked up the wedding incident, thankfully, but the story had spread locally, distorted and reframed. Farmer disrupts community event with livestock stampede. Local eccentric sabotages wedding. Property line feud escalates into spectacle. Not from any official outlet, but from blogs, newsletters, neighborhood forums. Karen knew how to seed a narrative. So Roy adjusted. He changed his patterns. Started driving into town through the back road instead of the main one. Moved his supply deliveries to odd hours. He installed more cameras, silent, hidden, with wireless feeds, and began logging everything. Not to retaliate, but to prepare. He began recording every conversation he had related to the land, every interaction with a stranger, every unsolicited visit. He wrote it all down, times, dates, faces, not because he was paranoid, but because he'd lived long enough to know that justice wasn't something you earned. It was something you built, brick by brick, with facts no one could ignore. One morning, a county vehicle pulled into his drive. A young man stepped out with a clipboard and a fake smile. He introduced himself as an assessor, routine property value reassessment due to regional development shifts. Roy invited him in, watched as he wandered the property with thinly veiled disapproval, making small notes about non-standard fencing and improper drainage layout. When Roy asked for clarification, the man shrugged and said the board had submitted a formal request for reclassification. If approved, it could change Roy's zoning designation from agricultural to transitional mixed use, which would dramatically increase his taxes and make certain farm operations non-compliant. Roy didn't react. He just escorted the man off the property, then called his lawyer and had a copy of his agricultural exemption mailed to every department that might touch zoning. The response was tepid. Some departments confirmed receipt, others ignored him. The silence wasn't apathy. It was strategy. Bury him in the process. Exhaust him with inaction. But Roy had time. He spent the next 3 weeks reinforcing everything, literally and figuratively. He met with a private surveyor and had the property remapped with digital precision. He had it notarized, then registered with the county clerk, adding a public stamp to what should have never been questioned. He reached out to the local ag co-op and arranged a field visit, leveraging their legal resources and long-standing lobbying contacts. Quietly, he made connections with the press. Not the mainstream media, but agricultural trade journals and land rights advocacy outlets. He didn't give them a story. Not yet. He just introduced himself, laid groundwork, started a conversation. If the storm broke, he wanted his version ready. And all the while, Karen stayed quiet. Too quiet. No new letters, no new offers. Just an absence that felt more deliberate than a confrontation. Then, one evening, Roy found a red ribbon tied to the gate of his north pasture. Just one. No note, no context. Just a ribbon, fluttering in the wind. The same shade used on the wedding arch. A message, unmistakable. He took it down, but he didn't discard it. He pinned it to the barn wall, a reminder, not of fear, but of the line, and how far they were willing to cross it. It wasn't the ribbon alone that did it, though it certainly didn't help. What pushed Roy over the line, firmly, irrevocably, was the certified letter he received 4 days later, stamped with a seal he'd seen only once before. Years ago, when a distant cousin had been sued over a property boundary dispute that drained his savings and nearly cost him his home. This letter, brief and clinical, declared that Roy Brady was the subject of a formal civil complaint filed in county court by the neighborhood board and its chair, Karen Bledsoe. The accusation: intentional disruption of a permitted event, endangerment of public safety, destruction of community assets, and hostile interference with local infrastructure. In legal terms, it was theater. But in reality, it was war, and it was being fought with bureaucracy, not bullets. Roy read the letter once, then again, then set it down slowly on the table next to his coffee, staring at it like one might stare at a scorpion crawling across a dinner plate. He wasn't surprised. He was furious. Yes, there was rage burning beneath his calm, but he'd anticipated something like this. He just hadn't expected them to be so bold, so publicly confident that they could rewrite the truth in ink and affidavits and expect it to stick. The date of the initial hearing was set for 6 weeks out. Plenty of time to prepare, and prepare he did. Roy's lawyer, a seasoned litigator named Dalton, who had grown up baling hay in the next county over, called the move desperate and poorly timed, but cautioned Roy not to underestimate it. "They're not trying to win in court," Dalton said flatly. "They're trying to wear you down, make you look unstable, turn public opinion so that when you fight back, you look like the aggressor." Roy didn't need to be told. He'd seen the way people looked at him at the feed store lately, like a cautionary tale in progress. He'd lived long enough to know the danger of people who believed their righteousness outweighed someone else's rights. But Roy hadn't been idle, and the moment the suit was filed, everything he'd quietly assembled began to matter. His documentation, dates, times, photos, videos, recordings, was comprehensive, clear, and backed by independent assessments. His digital parcel maps contradicted the neighborhood's shared use claims outright. His footage of the fence cutting, the unauthorized power tap, the post-wedding damage, and even the environmental consultant's reluctant confession were lined up and indexed. Dalton built a counter case like a dam, one stone at a time, and Roy signed off on every move with a steady hand and eyes that never left the horizon. But paperwork alone didn't resolve what was happening. Because while the legal process churned slowly toward its scheduled collision, real things were still happening in real time. Roy began receiving calls from businesses he'd worked with for years: his feed supplier, a welding shop, the irrigation guy who handled spring calibrations, all saying they'd been contacted by someone asking questions about Roy's operation. Nothing direct, just casual inquiries about licensing, compliance, back taxes. Roy thanked them all and made notes, adding the encounters to his growing log. It was death by 1,000 phone calls, and it wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about making him tired, but Roy didn't tire easily. On the day of the pre-trial mediation, Karen arrived dressed like a senator, all tailored lines and muted power colors, flanked by 2 attorneys with matching laptops and expressions that hovered somewhere between boredom and disdain. Roy came in wearing clean denim and a pressed shirt, his boots polished not for show but because they had always been kept that way when facing serious business. The mediator, a woman with sharp eyes and a weary voice, asked everyone to sit, to breathe, to consider constructive dialogue. Karen's lawyer opened with a list of demands: a public apology, payment for the emotional distress experienced by guests, an agreement that Roy would allow supervised use of his northern field for community-facing events no more than 6 times per year. Roy's lawyer didn't even bother to respond. He simply slid a thick folder across the table with a soft thud. Inside, evidence, precedent, expert statements, and a summary motion to dismiss with prejudice. The mediator flipped through the first few pages, her eyes narrowing. Karen tried to interject, words like context, misunderstanding, good faith, but they rang hollow. Facts didn't care about tone. The session ended with no resolution, which was the best outcome Roy could have hoped for. No settlement, no compromise, just a hard, visible line drawn where none had been respected before. But the courtroom wasn't where Roy found the real victory. That came 3 days later in the form of a letter from the county attorney's office, completely unrelated to the civil suit, responding to the documentation Roy had submitted months earlier about the tampering with his utility access and the contamination incident. The letter informed him that, due to the volume and credibility of evidence, a formal investigation had been opened into the neighborhood board's conduct, including potential misuse of public infrastructure and illegal alteration of private utility lines. It was just the beginning, but it was enough. Roy didn't smile when he read it. He didn't gloat. He just sat down, exhaled through his nose, and finally allowed his shoulders to loosen. But Karen didn't relent. The next escalation wasn't legal. It was personal. She showed up, unannounced, at the edge of Roy's field one morning, just as he was finishing a perimeter check. No entourage, no attorneys, just her, in oversized sunglasses and that familiar posture that suggested the world owed her a moment of attention. She didn't ask permission to approach. She simply stood at the fence, arms crossed, watching him. "You won't win," she said like a mantra. Roy didn't respond. "You think you've made some kind of stand, but all you've done is isolate yourself. People don't want to live next to a battlefield." Still, he said nothing. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "This isn't about land anymore. This is about principle. And if you think you can hold out forever—" Roy raised a hand, palm out, finally speaking. "You don't speak for principle. You speak for entitlement. And the difference between us is that I know the weight of what I stand on." Karen looked like she wanted to say more, But instead she turned and walked away, heels digging into the dirt she didn't think she'd ever have to touch. Roy watched her go. Then he turned back toward the barn, the field, the sky beyond, and got back to work. By the time the actual court date arrived, the wind had shifted. Not in any mystical sense, but in the way it always does when enough weight has been stacked on one side of a scale and the tension can no longer hold. The courtroom wasn't full, just the necessary parties, a few local reporters who had picked up whispers from agricultural blogs, and two elderly men who Roy recognized from the co-op, sitting quietly in the back like sentinels. Karen came with a smaller entourage this time. No designer handbag, no broadcast smile, just tight lips and a face that had finally started to show the cracks beneath its practiced calm. Her attorney was tense, less certain. They knew what was coming. Roy's attorney, Dalton, was calm as ever, not because he expected an easy win, but because everything they needed was already on record. When the judge entered, when the statements were read, when the evidence was reviewed, there were no outbursts, no gasps. Just a cold, factual unraveling. The video footage, the maps, the surveyor's testimony, the environmental documents, the recorded statements from the electrician and vet, each piece placed on the table like bricks in a wall. Karen's side objected. The judge overruled. When Roy was called to speak, he did so plainly. No speeches, no anger, just facts. What had been done to him? What had not been asked? What had been taken? And what he had done to protect it? Not to retaliate, but to reclaim. The ruling came 3 days later, delivered in writing. The court dismissed the complaint against Roy with prejudice, awarded him compensatory damages for property interference, and referred 2 members of the neighborhood board to a regulatory review committee for potential misconduct. The judge's final line read like a reprimand carved in stone. Property ownership, regardless of majority will or aesthetic value, is not subject to consensus, but to law. This court recognizes that boundary. Roy didn't celebrate. He didn't post online. He didn't give interviews. He went home, opened the gate to his field, and let the pigs out under the same sky that had watched over his grandfather's fence posts. The board dissolved 6 weeks later. Under pressure from the investigation, 2 members resigned and Karen stepped down without announcement. A community advisory panel was formed in its place, stripped of enforcement power, advisory only, and with clear boundaries reinstated. They asked Roy to serve on it. He declined. He recommended Claire, the deputy. She accepted. Roy didn't attend the first meeting. He was too busy fixing the west gate, where the wind had warped the hinges. It felt good, the heft of a wrench in his hand, the creak of iron in the sun. But change didn't just come to the board. Word had spread, quietly but effectively, and Roy began receiving letters. From other property owners, from farmers in counties he hadn't visited in years, from strangers who had read about the man who stood his ground when the subdivision forgot where it ended. Some wrote in anger, some in solidarity, some in confusion. Roy answered to none of them, not because he didn't care, but because he didn't want to be a symbol. He just wanted his field, his fence, his silence. But something had shifted, and even in retreat he understood what had been proven, that the lines people ignored out of convenience were real. That land doesn't lose value because someone else wants a better view. That trespass is not softened by banners and bouquets. And so Roy returned to his rhythm. Up before light. Boots by the door. Pigs fed before coffee. The wedding wreckage was long gone. The ground healed by rain and